Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here with you at our last live webinar. I've been here a couple of times last week, but again, my name is Stephanie Ertis, and I'm the Associate Director here at MCASA. So we are going to jump right into this training, and we are going to end where we began with a breathing exercise. So this presentation today is really about you. Up until now, we've really talked about how you will be helping and serving sexual assault survivors. This final webinar is for our sexual assault victim advocates, and it focuses on you and preparing and sustaining you for this work. So I invite you to relax, soften your gaze or close your eyes, and bring your attention to your inhale and your exhale. You're not forcing air in or out. You're just breathing. Try to bring the breath into balance. So your inhales are the same amount of time as your exhales. Relax into the rhythm. And try letting your thoughts go for just a moment. We'll take one deep breath together to the count of 4. So to begin, I invite everyone to exhale all the air in your lungs. Then begin the inhale, filling your lungs to the count of 2, 3, 4. Pausing and hold the air in your lungs, and then exhale, emptying your lungs to the count of 2, 3, 4. Take a few more deep breaths like this one on your own to whatever count feels comfortable to you. Filling your lungs and then releasing the air in your lungs. While you're taking some deep breaths, we want to again take this time to acknowledge the survivors that are among us and have been with us for the last 2 weeks, and the survivors that we will help as advocates. Take a moment here to appreciate yourself for being in this training these last 2 weeks, and for all you have learned and all you will do for survivors in the future. We want to maintain our commitment to gentle and honest conversation and dialogue as we learn together today and beyond today, and focus in on this very important topic of taking care of ourselves. If you haven't already, allow your breath to return to normal with a gentle inhale and exhale. Enjoy a few more moments here. When you are ready, come out of the exercise by beginning to move your body, maybe wiggling your fingers and toes, blinking your eyes, shrugging your shoulders, or even stretching your arms overhead. Then bring all your focus and attention back to the training, and we will begin. So today's training is really 3 separate trainings. So it's kind of 3 mini trainings that Alyssa and I have put into one training. And we're going to begin with talking about professional ethics. And to start, we're going to just go over the objectives. What will this first mini training do? So we're going to define boundaries and ethics. We're going to explore the reason and purpose for them. And then we're going to apply the ethical compass to our advocacy work. So we have a little activity at the end of this first mini presentation. And I like to start out this part of the presentation with 2 quotes. The first one, the first step in the evolution of ethics is a sense of solidarity with other humans. It really talks about ethics connection to human beings. And the second quote, action indeed is the sole medium of expression for ethics. This connects ethics to action. So really what we're talking about is the guidelines, codes, rules that help us make decisions about the actions we take with survivors that we're trying to help. So I want to talk about, we're talking about ethics and boundaries today. So we start with talking about boundaries because that plays right into our conversation about ethics. So let's just start out by really making sure everyone knows what boundaries are. So the definition here is that boundaries are limits we set up for our own protection and the protection of clients. So the purpose of boundaries is to build a supportive, healing environment. When it comes to boundaries, the overall best advice I can give you as an advocate is to release your attachment to the survivor's choices. If you start having opinions or hoping for a certain action that a survivor will take, or you want them to have certain kinds of emotions, or you're using words like should when you're talking about what a survivor should do, you are crossing a boundary. We have talked extensively about empowering survivors and giving them the resources and support they need to make the decisions they see best for them. To empower them, we need to dissolve our own opinions of what we think is best for them. So what do we create boundaries around? So put this in the chat. So if I can get a couple of folks to kind of write in the chat, what are the things that your agency, or maybe you personally as a professional working as an advocate, create boundaries around? And then I have a slide. We'll see how many of our boundaries match up. So what does your agency have boundaries or rules around, or what are some of your boundaries? If you want to share them, please share them as you feel comfortable. It's not a requirement, but put in the chat what you think we build boundaries around. Yeah, so the written rules. So what are the written rules about? Are they about, I'll give you one. Relationships, I'll give you another one. Money, like what are they around? Personal boundaries, personal relationships. Anna just put that in the chat. What are some other things we build boundaries around? I'll give you a second to put some more in the chat. Mental boundaries, so the like mental load that you can take on when you're working with a survivor. Sure. There might be some things in place to protect kind of your mental, emotional health. There are boundaries around that. Other things that we might build boundaries around. I will let you continue putting them in the chat, and I will put some of ours up here that we have come up with. This is not an inclusive list, but it is a list of some of the top things that we build boundaries around. And we create boundaries around these things because people can manipulate them to exert power and control over someone. So sexual assault, as we have talked about, is about power and control. So when working with sexual assault survivors, we need to create boundaries around the things that can be used to exert power and control and can be perceived to create a power imbalance that could lead to control. So what we're really trying to say here is, we want to make sure as advocates, we're not exerting power and control in an inappropriate way. And we want to make sure that the clients we're working with are not doing that to us. So we set up these rules or boundaries around some of these things. We talked about personal relationship, around money, communication. So there's probably some, protocols or rules around the best way to communicate with a survivor. So, so they're not calling your personal phone, maybe they would be calling an organization phone. When you're working on a hotline or helpline, you're working with that line's phone number. You're not going to give a survivor on that line your personal phone number for them to call you. Social media and how you interact with the clients on social media. Intimate relationships, so making sure that you're not building an intimate relationship with this client that you're working with. Physical interactions, drug and alcohol, and confidentiality. These are some of the things we build some of these rules and boundaries around to help keep everybody safe. So let's talk about and define ethics as well. So if you look up the definition of ethics, this is what it says, like a set of moral principles, a theory, or a system of moral values. And I really think that this definition, though probably technically accurate, is very circular. I don't think it's very helpful in the context of working with sexual assault survivors. So I created a definition for the purposes of sexual assault survivors working with clients that have experienced sexual violence. So I like the definition of a set of guidelines that helps us make decisions. So when I think about ethics, I kind of think about this bucket of like how we do our work. And I think about these big rocks that go into the bucket. And these rocks are like laws. Like these are the laws we abide by to make sure that we're working with clients well. And then I think about these little pebbles that then get dumped in the bucket and they go in between the big boulders and the laws. And these little pebbles are the rules of our agency, the practices of our agency, the stuff that's written down that says we do this or we don't do this. Well, you can't write down everything. So then if you dump sand into that bucket and it fills up all the cracks between those big boulders and those little pebbles, that's what I consider ethics. Ethics is what guides us when there isn't a big rock or a little pebble to tell us what to do. So let's look at some of the professional ethics that are out there. So these ethics are based on standard principles across a field or a company or a nonprofit. And so various jobs have agreed upon professional ethics. So we kind of look to those as examples or to inform our ethical code as advocates. A great example here is social work. On the screen is a sample of the code of ethics that social workers use. So if you are a social worker joining us today, this is probably very familiar. This is often taught to social workers from day one, and many social workers can recite parts of this ethical code by heart. When talking about the reasons for boundaries and ethics to keep yourself and clients safe, this makes perfect sense. Social workers deal with highly sensitive areas: substance abuse, child welfare, sexual assault, mental health. It's important for them to have a strong and clear set of ethics to guide that work. So other professions that have strong ethical codes, law, medicine, mental health, like licensed practical counselors have a very strong ethical code. The Department of Justice has an ethical code. These professions all work with people in vulnerable circumstances where the power differential can be quite great. So ethics helps protect everyone involved. And these are kind of a few examples. Like if you are, working with a lawyer, they have an ethical code that they're following. So you can make sure you're not being taken advantage of. And if you are, there's some repercussions and accountability for that. Same thing when you go to the doctor. Same thing when you go to a mental health practitioner. So I want to take another look at kind of this sample ethical code from the social work examiners. And you'll see in here really really important words. So, they're talking about, confidentiality, they're talking about obligation, they're talking about accuracy, and all of these things kind of play into that protection of a client. And we're going to look at another ethical code. So the Department of Justice also has a very strong ethical code for the folks that they have working with victims. So they're victim assistance providers. They have various names, and some of you may be in this program. So it may look very familiar to you. But the words here that really stick out to me are things like share knowledge, conduct as far as it relates to relationship, professional education, use of personal social media platforms. All of those things are really kind of spelled out in this ethical code. So if you are a survivor seeking services from one of these victim assistance providers, this is how they operate. And this is what you should be able to expect from them. So I want to talk about using those two examples. I want to talk a little bit about advocate ethics and what that might look like for you. Here are some guidelines that you can use to make decisions when you're working with a client. You are focused on the survivor's wishes. You are advocating for the survivor. So when you're doing your work, there may be other influences. Law enforcement may be involved. They may have family members involved, but you are focused on their needs. Ethically, as an advocate, that's the direction you need to be going in. You may help the survivor with a variety of issues. So that's not necessarily an ethical principle, but know that ethically, you can connect them to other resources that may help. Honesty is one of the things we've talked about in many of our slides over this last 2 weeks. Honesty, transparency, empowerment. These are words that should be in your ethical code when it comes to working with sexual assault survivors. You want to stay within the realm of your responsibility. So you don't want to be practicing law or counseling. You want to stay in that role as an advocate. If they need legal advice or they need counseling, then we're referring them to those professionals. If you are a lawyer or a counselor, make sure that if you are acting as an advocate, you're staying in that advocate role and you're not moving outside of that into these other roles if that is not appropriate. And respecting boundaries, respecting the boundaries of the survivor and expecting your boundaries to be respected as well. So why are ethics important? And I think for advocates, and some of you may share this experience that I had as an advocate, but advocacy has its foundation in grassroots organizing and activism. And so you don't get a college degree in advocacy. You don't go to you don't get some kind of uh like professional designation or license to be an advocate. So it's important for us to commit to ethics to help legitimize the work that we do and help other people understand it. So it safeguards the reputation of the work that we're doing, and it protects the public from being exploited or someone coming into advocacy to exploit the public, which is rare, but it could happen. So ethics protect that. And it furthers the responsibility and the practice of the role. And so when I was doing advocacy work, I was accused of manipulating the client or putting words in the client's mouth or, talking to the survivor in a way that people, it was confidential. So people didn't know what I was saying. So they were making a lot of assumptions about it. And because of the ethics that I worked with, I was able to provide them with what it is like to have a confidential session with me without giving them any client or survivor information. I could say, for all survivors, I provide this information. I, reassure them these things. So this goes back to our first presentation on advocacy and like those crisis intervention techniques. So sharing that with folks and sticking to that is a way to like ethically support the work that you are doing. And side note to that story, the folks that were accusing me wanted confidential information and I refused to give it up. But I would give them kind of the ethical code that I operated with. And they did not get the confidential information out of me, obviously. And then it helped everyone I was working with understand the work of an advocate even more. So advocate ethics can be a little bit of a hard topic to wrap our head around. So we want to do this final exercise on ethics with you all. So instead of giving you a list of rules, we like to provide some guidelines, but we also want to provide you with one guiding principle to remember when making ethical decisions regarding working with sexual assault survivors. It's important It's impossible to come up with every scenario that could be an ethical challenge. And as soon as we do, there's going to be an exception. So as soon as we say, you can never give a survivor money, there's going to be a situation where, as an advocate, it was actually appropriate for you to do that and then be reimbursed or whatever. Like the circumstances called for this thing. And ethically, it was okay. So we give you this ethical compass to kind of make a decision on, should I do this or should I not? Like ethically, what am I obligated to do here? So when you are faced with an ethical decision, which typically is not during 9 to 5, here are a couple of things you can do. So the first thing you want to do is look to the laws and policies of your organization. Is there anything that has been said that I need to do here? The next thing is to consult with your supervisor if you have that opportunity. Often you're faced with these decisions after hours, in a hospital, on a hotline call, maybe in a courtroom where you may not have access to all of those things. So this is the kind of third thing you might want to consider. Does this action upset the balance of power between myself or my agency and the survivor? Like what I want to do, is this going to upset the balance of power? And so we have a little way for us to look at this. We have a little scenario, an example. So imagine that we are all out to dinner to celebrate your birthday, and you are at your favorite restaurant. We're having a great time. You're enjoying lots of good food and lots of treats. And you know the server from your role as an advocate. They used your organization's services a little while ago, and you know how hard they worked to rebuild their life after the assault. You spend about $37 on your meal. What is an appropriate tip? So you're kind of faced with this ethical decision. Like, I know this person needs some money. I want to give them money, but like, what is the ethical thing to do here if you know them as an advocate? So put in the chat what you think an appropriate tip would be for about a $37 bill that a survivor was the server for you and your team. So yeah, populate that in the chat. I don't know why I said staff. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So the question you're asking yourself here is, you're acknowledging the power differential between you as someone that helped this person, or your agency that helped this person, and them. So is your action abusing or manipulating this power differential? Are you using your power to control or influence the survivor's action? So these are the questions you ask yourself. So we're getting $10. We're getting some percentages here, 25%, 20%, 25%. Sometimes I have people that do the exact math. So 15% is $5.50 about, 20% is about $7.40. And these are good answers, right? I would say that anywhere from like $5 to $8 is probably good, maybe a little extra. I think that anything beyond that could really tip the differential a little bit. Like I don't want to be like, hey, it's $7.40. I'm going to throw down a $10 bill on this. That's probably not going to tip the differential, right? That might just be, that person's going to recognize that as a thank you. But say you are, you just hit the lottery and you're like, oh, I really want to give them like 20, 30 bucks, 20 or $30 on a $37 bill could really make that person feel uncomfortable. So you have to think about it from their perspective, not just your perspective. So these answers, 15 to 20 to 25% are probably a great amount of tip. It's a little bit extra in some cases, but it's not enough to like really make them feel like they would be emboldened to you because you helped them. So yeah, great answers. So with that, we are going to move on to the second part of our presentation, and Alyssa is going to do this section.
Thank you. So this next little section, as Stephanie said, is on vicarious trauma. Next slide. So the learning objectives for this little section is to understand the terminology of vicarious trauma, to compare and contrast vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout, and to identify warning signs of vicarious trauma and burnout. Next slide. So to break down vicarious trauma, vicarious means experiencing or taking on someone else's experiences through empathy. And trauma, as we've previously discussed, is a deeply distressing or disturbing event. So taken together, this is the emotional residue of exposure that those have from interacting with people as they are hearing stories of trauma and become witnesses to the pain, fear, and terror the trauma survivors have endured. So before moving on to the next slide, let's put into the chat, what are some examples of professionals who may be at risk of experiencing vicarious trauma? And again, these are the people who did not directly experience the trauma, but through interacting with people who did directly experience it, they are experiencing that emotional residue. Anyone have any ideas of professionals who may be at risk? Yes, so advocates, counselors, therapists. Yes, definitely. Any others? Law enforcement. Yep. Yep. So those are all great examples. Next slide, and we'll take a look at some more examples. So basically, anyone who interacts with people experiencing trauma have some knowledge of a traumatic event are at risk. So I see in the chat, medical healthcare. Yep, definitely. Some others could be legal services staff, such as lawyers, paralegals, educators, caretakers, social workers, and again, anyone with indirect exposure to the trauma. EMTs, yep, definitely. That's another one. So some signs of experiencing vicarious trauma can include physical and psychological symptoms, often associated with the trauma. This also is referred to as secondary traumatic stress. So some of these secondary traumatic stress symptoms may include re-experiencing a survivor's traumatic event, avoiding reminders of the event, and persistent psychological arousal. Some additional signs of vicarious trauma can include emotional attachment to a survivor's decisions, over-identifying with the survivor's story, difficulty in maintaining professional boundaries, and being overly preoccupied with thoughts of a survivor outside of the workplace. Another cost of caring that I want to highlight is something called countertransference. Have any of you heard of countertransference before? You can just put a yes or a no in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing some mixed answers. So I'm just going to briefly touch on it to make sure we're all on the same page. So countertransference is when the helping professional, such as a social worker, law enforcement officer, advocate, therapist, unconsciously projects their feelings about a client's situation back onto the client. So, for example, let's say the client or survivor is describing a sexual assault that they've experienced. And in describing it, the helping professional begins to feel a certain type of way about that experience. This could be because the client's situation reminds the advocate of a sexual assault experience that they've previously had, or that someone that they know has previously had. And so those feelings about that previous incident are starting to get in the way of what the advocate needs to do with the client or survivor. So maybe they say something like, well, you should have done XYZ, or why didn't you do XYZ? And that can damage the relationship between the survivor and the therapist or helping professional, because it gets in the way of building that rapport or that trust. The important thing to remember is that countertransference can be managed by maintaining healthy boundaries between the work life and personal life. And we'll get into some additional ways in the later slides about how to manage vicarious trauma, countertransference, and all of those things. Next slide. So, according to a study published in 2019 from the Journal of Social Work on predictors of secondary traumatic stress among social workers, 80% of survey respondents reported meeting diagnostic criteria for at least one of the three secondary traumatic stress scales symptom clusters. So, what does this mean? So, the first symptom cluster is intrusion symptoms. These symptoms include intrusive thoughts about clients, disturbing dreams about clients, sense of reliving clients' trauma, psychological distress, and physiological reactions. The second symptom cluster is avoidance symptoms. So we have intrusion, and now we're on to avoidance. Avoidance symptoms can include avoiding clients, avoiding people, places, or things that remind you of the client situation, inability to recall client information, diminished activity level, detachment from others, and emotional numbing. And the final symptom cluster is arousal symptoms. So we had intrusion, avoidance, and now we're on to arousal. Arousal symptoms can include sleeping, difficulty sleeping, irritability, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, and being easily startled. So going back to that 80%. So 80% of the survey respondents reported experiencing symptoms that are in at least one of those three symptom clusters. 31% of the survey respondents experienced secondary traumatic stress due to directly working with a client who experienced trauma. And of those who worked directly with traumatized clients, 40.35% reported having trouble sleeping as a result of their work. 39.47% reported having trouble concentrating. 35.96% felt emotionally numb. And 14.91% reported disturbing dreams about their work with clients. Next slide. People who experience vicarious trauma may also be at risk of something called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is empathetic strain and general exhaustion resulting from caring for people in distress. Some signs of compassion fatigue include emotional detachment and numbness, social withdrawal, intrusive negative thoughts, and secretive self-medication. Next slide. So some long-term consequences of vicarious trauma and prolonged stress are burnouts, and we'll get into that on the next slide. Burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands. Some signs that you may be experiencing burnout include poor attitude towards coworkers, the agency, or your clients, losing your why, so that sense of purpose of why we're here doing this work, continued exhaustion, and decreased performance and productivity at work. Next slide. So every person we encounter has likely experienced direct or indirect exposure to trauma within their lifetime. Trauma-informed practice should not end with how clients are served. Professionals in the victim services field can also benefit from a trauma-informed practice within their place of work. So agencies should prioritize policies to help prevent and address vicarious trauma and burnout in the workplace. Next slide. So if your workplace is not currently using trauma-informed practices to address vicarious trauma and burnout, advocate for it. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Stephanie for self-care.
All right, thanks, Alyssa. So you've probably heard the term self-care before. We've talked about it like a lot in different circles, but we want to really explain self-care and we want to analyze why we don't practice self-care. We're also going to describe the consequences of poor self-care and then classify and evaluate self-care strategies. And at the end, Alyssa has a tool for us to help create a personal self-care plan. So let's kind of start at the beginning. What actually is self-care if we try to define it? So these are intentional activities and practices meant to reduce stress and maintain physical, psychological, and emotional health. We also like to add spiritual health in there, and we'll add some like work, professional health in there as well as we go on. Before we get into self-care, I also want to talk about the difference between self-care and self-soothing. Self-soothing techniques help you to stay calm and relaxed when you are feeling overwhelmed, both physically and emotionally. They help you to regulate so that you can feel like yourself again. They get us through the present moment. You often hear the term self-soothing as part of infant or child development. So babies sleeping through the night or waking up but not crying out. We carry these self-soothing techniques with us throughout our lifetime, though, and they change and grow as we change and grow. So self-soothing techniques are typically things that we like to do, that we want to do, that we resort to when we're feeling stressed. So maybe it's stuff like yoga or golf or walking around the block, but it's also binge watching TV, scrolling or posting on social media, drinking a beer or a glass of wine after a stressful day, eating a piece of dark chocolate, or I'm not judging here, eating all the chocolate in your house, regardless of whether it's dark chocolate or not. All of those things are self-soothing. And self-soothing is absolutely a part of our self-care. It helps us manage stress. It helps us keeps us happy and relaxed. But self-care goes beyond making ourselves feel better and is really about taking care of ourselves and building our resilience. So an example from my own life is that I love doing yoga. I do yoga on a regular basis. And this for me is both self-soothing and self-care. But I also, every spring, go to all my doctors. So this past spring, I went to my PCP. I went to, I'm a cancer survivor. So I went to my cancer survivor doctor, my cancer doctor. I had to go to a cardiologist this year. So I went and had those tests done. I went to my dentist. I went to my dermatologist. I did all of those appointments. I have a couple tests coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm over the age of 40. I'm a cisgender woman over the age of 40. So I have a mammogram scheduled 3 weeks from now. I have to get a bone density test done. All of those things are self-care, but I don't find any of those things soothing. So after most of those appointments, I usually like go get myself a self-soothing iced coffee to balance everything out. That's a lot about what self-care is. So when we think about self-care, we want to think about beyond that glass of wine, beyond that hot bath, beyond that walk around the block. We want to think about what we have to do for ourselves to make sure that we are building resilience, taking care of our bodies, our emotions, our minds, our work professionalism, all of those things. So self-soothing techniques can also go against our strategy for taking care of ourselves. For example, and this is one also from my own life, baking delicious treats and eating them might be self-soothing, but eating a bunch of sugary treats all the time could go against our self-care. So we want to make sure that we are keeping that self-soothing in check. So we want to talk about why we don't practice self-care. So feel free to drop in the chat why you don't practice self-care. I've put a couple of them on the screen here. So we feel selfish. We have too many other people to take care of. Not enough money. One of the things that has really agitated me over the last couple of years when we talk about self-care is it can be linked to something expensive. Like you need some self-care, go to the spa. Well, spas are expensive. You need some self-care, So, join this thing that costs a lot of money, or buy this program or book that costs a lot of money. Self-care does not have to be expensive. Um, so you want to make sure that like it can be expensive if you have a lot of money to spend on it, but there are self-care things you can do that cost little or no money. Oftentimes people say they don't practice self-care because they're too busy. So this is my soapbox about why we don't practice self-care. And I use this Audre Lorde quote because I think it's really important when we think about self-care. And she says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And this is an act of political warfare. So some of you have been doing this for a while. Some of you have been working with survivors for a short amount of time. But it has a high burnout rate, like we said. So the more self-care we practice, the longer we're going to be able to do this work, the more of this work we're going to be able to do, the more influence we'll have with ending sexual assault. So when you think about self-care as being selfish or not having enough time, it's really building us into an entire force of folks that can sustain the work of ending sexual violence. So let's talk about the consequences of poor self-care. And I am going to invite you, as you are comfortable, to put into the chat how you know when you aren't practicing good self-care. And so I call this a little confession time. So how does your body, your emotions, your mind, how does it tell you you are not practicing good self-care? Like, what are the signs for you? um, are often our bodies will tell us. Sometimes our family members will tell us when they feel like we're not practicing good self-care. So I invite you to put that in the chat. I will tell you, for me, I have two big indicators. One is I have an eye that will start twitching uncontrollably if I've been spending too much time at my computer, if I'm stressed, if I'm not practicing good care, I'm not getting up and moving around, my eye will really start to twitch. Some of you also might have this symptom. I clench my teeth. I clench my teeth so hard when I sleep that I bit through a lifetime guaranteed retainer in 15 months. I destroyed the whole thing because I clench my teeth so hard when I'm not practicing good self-care. And you can't relax your teeth in the middle of the night because you're sleeping, your jaw in the middle of the night because you're sleeping. So you have to do other things throughout the day so that you're not going to bed with all of that stress. So what are some of the things that you all experience? High blood pressure and headaches, irritability, impatience with others. I think this is like a really big one that a lot of us share. Feeling tired all the time, sleep disturbances, social anxiety. And the one way you'll see this, I see this with myself and some of my other friends that have stressful jobs, is social anxiety. They'll cancel plans. Like they just don't want to be out. They don't want to be with other people. They don't want to be in a crowd. So that is also an indication you might not be doing good self-care. That's a stress thing that comes up. Yeah, these are great examples of what we experience when we're not practicing good self-care. And here on the screen are just a couple of areas that get impacted by our inability or our not practicing enough self-care. Sorry, I stumbled over that a bit. So it could damage relationships, loss of self-esteem, isolation. So like I talked about, like canceling plans with friends or family, wanting to be by ourselves all the time, can cause poor morale at work, low motivation, absenteeism, lateness, lack of focus. And health-wise, these are 5 symptoms on the screen. I'm not even going to read them to you all. There could be another 50 symptoms. Everyone's body reacts differently to stress. And so, but our physical body is impacted by it. So taking care of ourselves in all of the ways that we need to for self-care is important. And so with that, I'm going to invite you, don't put it in the chat yet. We're going to go through a whole exercise here on self-care. But I want you to think about what some of your self-care and self-soothing techniques are that you might want to share with the group. And I know that you might be thinking, oh, like mine are the same as everyone else's, but I think it's important for us to speak them into this space so that we can learn from each other some ways that other people are really taking care of themselves. So Alyssa's going to go over a couple of self-care strategies, and then we're going to share a lot about what we do for our own self-care. So share again at whatever level you're comfortable with, but start thinking of those while she goes through these next two slides. So Alyssa, I'm turning it back to you.
Thank you. So in terms of self-care strategies, we think about recognizing and watching out for the warning signs of compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And once you recognize those signs, you want to undo that damage by managing your stress, seeking support, and working on your self-care activities. And then that goes back into rebuilding your resilience to stress by taking care of your physical and emotional health, as well as other aspects of your well-being. Something that I want to add here with these 3 bullet points is that this is not a linear process. Self-care is things that you can do to actively prevent burnout and stress. And it's also things that you can do after the fact, after you're experiencing those symptoms or those signs. And then you want to rebuild your resilience to that stress. Next slide. So when thinking about what you're doing for self-care, it may be helpful to create a self-care action plan. So starting out, you want to identify the problem. So the thing that is largely contributing to your stress or your burnout or compassion fatigue. And then next, you want to set a goal for yourself to slow or halt those signs that you're experiencing. And when you think about the goal, think about like something that is very broad or very general. So for example, increasing your resilience to stress. That's a very broad goal, right? So when you think about strategies, those are like little mini goals that fit under your broad goal. So you're developing a strategy such as, maybe you're increasing your physical wellness. That goes to building your resilience to burnout, right? So it's still kind of broad. You're, increasing your physical wellness, but you're also specific enough that it fits under your goal. Then we get into your techniques. So these are specific, they are measurable, and it's about figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. And when it doesn't work out, you find something new. So these are like your little activities that fit under your strategies. So if your strategy was to increase physical wellness, maybe your technique is going for a 20-minute walk every other day, or getting up early and going for a run for 20 minutes, something like that. So those are measurable. You can assess whether you're actually doing it. You can assess whether 20 minutes is a good length of time for you. If you want to do shorter, you want to do longer, if you want to go for more days a week, less days a week. Ultimately, it's about what works best for you and how it fits into your schedule. Because the last thing that we want to do is create more stress in our lives. Next slide. All right, so on the next several slides, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the self-care wheel and these different sections of the wheel. And we invite you, as Stephanie said, to go ahead and put into the chat anything that you're doing for each of these different aspects of self-care as we go through the next couple of slides. Next slide. So first up, we have physical self-care. I think, yeah. So physical self-care can include things like eating a balanced diet, finding exercise that you enjoy, getting enough sleep, getting regular medical care, learning to recognize your body's warning signs, taking time for intimacy, and pampering yourself. So what are some ideas that you all have or different things that you are doing for physical self-care? Go ahead and put that in the chat. Daily stretching. Yep. Working out, yoga, going to the gym, going to bed in time. Yes. Relaxing music. gardening, bubble bath, proper rest, reading. Yeah, so these are all great examples. Yes, exercising. All right, next slide.
Great. So thank you for sharing about physical self-care. What are some things you do psychologically for self-care, like for some of that mental self-care? So these are things like finding a creative outlet, maybe participating in some kinds of therapy, mindfulness, taking time for yourself. So what do you do in that realm of self-care? And we know that advocates are actually really great at self-care. You wouldn't be able to do this work without it. So that's why we like to do this sharing section. Like, what are you doing in this area? Or what are you doing in this area? And kind of learning from each other some of the techniques that have really helped. So for advocates that have been doing this for a while, this is a great way for you to share with some folks that are new. And some folks that are new, it's a great way for you to share what self-care you're bringing to advocacy. So I'm seeing in the chat, therapy and watching comedies. Lindsay, I love this one. Like laughing is good psychological self-care. Watching comedies, watching your favorite show, different hobbies, adult coloring books, using different apps to help with your self-care. Oh, taking care of myself and taking care of the bird. I don't know what, like, if that's a pet, that's great. We're going to talk about pets. So that's awesome. So, Victoria, thanks for saying that. Maybe you have a bunch of birds that you take care of too. So, absolutely can good psychological um, self-care there. So, our next category, Alyssa's going to do, and it's along these same lines with emotional self-care, and you get to meet our pets. So, Alyssa, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks. So emotional self-care. So again, this is spending time with friends, family, or pets. As Stephanie mentioned, these are our cats. Mine is the one in the bottom corner, the gray one. And Stephanie's is the one on the top corner. We often talk about at MCASA how our pets are great role models for self-care.
Mhm.
Stephanie, anything you want to add about that?
Oh no, just so, well, sometimes my cat will even show up to this presentation. Yeah, if you have cats or if you have pets, they're unapologetic and asking for what they need, taking a nap in the middle of the day, wanting attention or wanting to talk. So I do think if you have a pet, they can provide some great comfort and some great examples of self-care.
I
Also,
see in the
okay.
chat someone said cats are self-care icons. Yes, I agree with that. Um, so some other forms of emotional self-care are finding a hobby that makes you happy, recognizing your hard work, watching a funny movie, as someone previously said, and releasing your emotions, so laughing, crying, etc. Um, it looks like Stephanie, the bird is in the app that this person uses.
Okay,
Um,
cool. Cool.
and I see in the chat some people have put hobbies, collecting different things. So those are all great examples. Yes.
Oh, sorry, I don't know why I started going backwards there. So let's talk about spiritual self-care. And spiritual self-care, we want to differentiate this from religion. This is not, this could be about religious practices, but there are other ways to think about your spiritual self-care as well. So enjoying nature, finding a spiritual community, meditating, practicing self-reflection, volunteering for a cause that is outside the area of sexual assault, if that's your formal work. So we just talked about pets. So maybe volunteering for something that has to do with animals or something that is different than, volunteering at a community garden. Someone talked about gardening as physical self-care, but gardening is one of those ones that can cross several of these categories. So these categories kind of intertwine with each other as well. So you could look at gardening as physical work, so physical self-care, emotional work or emotional self-care because it also it could also be soothing, or you could be really bring you a lot of joy, or spiritual self-care because you're really getting in getting connected to nature and something that's growing. So please put in the chat any kind of spiritual self-care that you want to share. Some of the other things we see here sometimes are journaling, praying along with meditating, being part of a religious organization or a religious community, attending church regularly. All of those things can play into self-care for your spiritual well-being. And this could be many, many things. Someone put in volunteering for an animal shelter. So taking your care and compassion that you use in your everyday job and applying that to a different population like animals. Yoga, absolutely. Yoga can be part of someone's spiritual self-care. Going to church on Sundays or as needed, like if that is part of your practice, absolutely. Spending time in nature, going for a hike, going camping, being by yourself in nature or being with other people in nature. All of those things are great for self-care when it comes to nature. Oh, I love this one, Gina. Thanks for putting this in here. Just gratitude. Just practicing gratitude can be a really important element of spiritual self-care.
We also have personal self-care. So these are things like creating a budget, which I know may not seem like self-care, but financial well-being is a large part of self-care. Making sure that you're not overspending, making sure that you are not stressed out by your money. And it also can be a way to practice emotional self-care or physical self-care. It doesn't have to be, but you could also buy stuff if your budget allows. That would help with those self-care aspects. Um, Personal self-care also includes developing a skill. So maybe it is learning to play a new sport or learning a new hobby, could be learning a new language even. Getting organized, making time for building relationships. So again, going back to the importance of maintaining a work-life boundary. So taking time to build those relationships outside of the workplace. And setting short-term and long-term goals. So what are some examples of personal self-care that you all do?
And as people are putting this in the chat, I recently was listening to a audiobook, I think, and she talked about something she called a money date. So she creates a self-soothing environment when she has to talk about something, when she has to do something stressful, like pay her bills or look at her budget or go through her bank account. So she's like, I take a nice bath, I wrap myself in my favorite pajamas, and I sit down and I have my money date. And so I really thought that that was an interesting way to look at personal self-care, because some of the stuff in this personal category it's really tough. Like these aren't the fun things like yoga or golfing or playing with our cats or watching a funny movie. So sometimes we have to be really intentional about this part of self-care, and we really want to use like maybe use some self-soothing techniques to go along with this. So yeah, I think someone just popped something in the chat there for you, Alyssa.
Yes. It looks like so someone says, I personally listen to podcasts or read self-help books. Yes, those are great examples of personal self-care. Anyone else?
So you all can continue to put some personal self-care in there. We also want to talk about professional self-care as well. And as a supervisor at MCASA, I like to do this slide because I think that your professional self-care can sometimes get neglected, especially if you have a really busy caseload. So I do think it's important to, during your workday, during your work, especially if it isn't confined to just a day, chatting and getting to know your coworkers at a level that feels comfortable. Doing some breathing exercises at your desk. We've done that twice already. So we've given you some examples there. But even pausing to take 1, 2, or 3 deep breaths can be helpful. Going for a walk, moving around during the day. Planning for professional development, planning and asking for professional development is an important part of your professional development. Setting reachable goals, talking about that with your supervisor, building that relationship of support. Take your sick days, and vacation days. You have earned that time. That is not a gift from your organization. You have earned that. So when you need it, take your sick days. Make sure you take your vacation days. I started talking to MCASA staff in like April. Schedule your vacation days. Put in your vacation days. Make sure you're taking those vacation days. I don't want you to lose that time. Even if you're not going anywhere, you don't have to go on vacation to take a vacation day. You can stay home and watch those funny movies if you want, or, garden or do all those other things. And taking some time for lunch, and this could be any kind of break, but taking some time during the day to like reassess, refocus, regroup. That is really helpful in getting stuff done the rest of the day. So MCASA has a really comprehensive lunch policy. Like everyone respects your lunch. If you say you're going on lunch, you're not going to talk to that person for the next 45 minutes or hour. And we really tried to build a culture around people being able to do that. Not all workplaces are like that. So I encourage you to look at your own work circumstance and figure out what is the best way for you to look at your day and see where you might be able to add some time in to help you do some self-care. So if you have other suggestions for professional self-care, please put those in the chat. I am going to move on to our last slide about one of our last slides about self-care too. And this is just a cautionary slide, and this kind of goes back to self-soothing. So there are some self-care things, really self-soothing things that could kind of outbalance what you're trying to do for long-term health and long-term resilience. So some of these things are on the slide. You know yourself best. So you know if you engage in any of these things, if they're getting out of whack. I'm not saying don't drink a cup of coffee in the morning and get your caffeine boost. I would absolutely never say that, or not say, don't enjoy your drinks after work or your dessert or any kind of other thing that you indulge in. You know when you're indulging too much. So just remember that self-care is about all of these things, and it's about moderation and balance and taking care of yourself and building your own resilience. So before I turn this next slide over to Alyssa, one of the things we notice when we do this workshop, and we notice in ourselves as well, we also are learning about our own self-care as we go through our own careers and our own work as advocates. But what we notice is that usually folks are really good in a couple of these categories we mentioned. Like they have a couple of really great self-care strategies in 2, 3, maybe even 4 of these. But there's sometimes some areas that they're not as, they don't have as much self-care techniques in. So Alyssa's going to explain this exercise and how it can help you balance your self-care.
So first of all, I want to start off by saying that you'll receive a copy of a blank self-care wheel that you can use to fill out as needed. But basically, thinking about the last couple of slides that we've gone over, what are some things that you're already doing? A lot of people in the chat are already doing really great self-care activities. And what are some additional activities maybe you could add to it, or things you want to try out? Thinking back to that self-care action plan, what is your goal that you're trying to accomplish? What are those strategies and techniques? And thinking about what you can do in the next 7 days to improve, or what can you do, ongoing to maintain your self-care. What are some things maybe you could do in the immediate if you recognize that you are starting to experience signs of vicarious trauma and you need to take a break and do some self-care. So just some things to be thinking about as we wrap up this webinar series. Just thinking about our own self-care and how we can continue to practice it and build our resilience to vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue. Next slide. All right, so that wraps up our presentation today. I posted the anonymous evaluation link into the chat. We greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. Additionally, if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. And upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. If you click on that link, you'll be able to access the certificate request form. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be sending out a follow-up email later today with a copy of the PowerPoint slides, the blank self-care wheel, the recording for today, as well as the evaluation link. If you have any questions, feel free to email us. Thank you again for coming today. We really appreciated doing this series with you.